I will begin by saying that my name is Nicole. I'm Stalo from Lakamal First Nation, and I have ancestry in Squamish Nation from Hamilton. And on my mom's side, I am third generation Canadian settler. And I'm really happy to be here with Rita Wong, Donna Clark, and Sara Ross. It's a huge honor. And yeah, so before I begin, I do want to say that the Hummingbird Trust is located on the unceded, the ancestral, and the traditional territories of the Coast Salish people, that being the Tsleil-Waututh, the Squamish, and the Musqueam. And here at Hummingbird Trust, we are dedicated to working towards reconciliation and redress. And so thank you everyone for being here. All right, so I'm going to be handing it off to Rita, Donna, and Sara in 1 second. The three of them are amazing humans. And Rita was actually a teacher of mine in Emily Carr, so it's a huge honor to have this kind of come full circle. But all of them have worked tirelessly to help defend not only the land, but the waterways and the flora and fauna that call this place home. And so I am so thankful for all of your work and all of your actions towards the Trans Mountain Pipeline and water and land defending. So thank you so much, and I will let you have the floor.
Thank you, Nicole, for that very lovely introduction. I think I'll give a quick introduction about the 1308 Trees Project and then turn it over to Donna and Sara. But I wanted to just start by acknowledging that it's more than 1308 trees. Those are the trees that, for folks who aren't already familiar with this, those are the trees that the Canada Energy Regulator has allowed Trans Mountain to cut down without permits from the city of Burnaby or New Westminster, and also without Indigenous consent. And many of us are here as people trying to be in good relation with the Indigenous peoples of this land. So the Musqueam, the Squamish, the Tsleil-Waututh, the Kwantlen, the Katzie, the Coquitlam, and the Kaikait First Nations. And, you know, it is, I would say, a work in progress to show up and to pay attention and to figure out what to do, because we're up against a very powerful and wealthy opponent, the Trans Mountain Pipeline. But we're also up against a kind of a way of thinking that is really disconnected from the land. And so when we spend time with the trees and the hummingbirds and all the creatures on the land, we're renewing that connection and honoring that connection. And that's one of the most important teachings, I think, that I have received from the local Coast Salish First Nations, is that we're all related. That concept of not samat, right? That what happens to the trees and the hummingbirds will happen to us eventually. And so we need to look out for each other and have each other's backs. And so the project started just to kind of, first of all, a little bit of context. Trans Mountain has been cutting down thousands and thousands of trees. And they've been cutting them down in the past 3 years within the tank farm perimeter, so inside the fencing, where people can't go, basically. But now they're spreading out further into public greenways and public right-of-ways, and basically places where people walk and spend time and care about what happens to the trees. And I just want to acknowledge and mourn the trees that have died already inside the Trans Mountain Tank Farm facility and the many life forms that depended on those trees. There was a red-tailed hawk's nest in there. There was many birds and creatures. And I am really grateful for the hummingbirds and the people who are keeping an eye out for the hummingbirds. But we also need to remember there's many more birds around, the flickers and the robins. And I'm sure Sara and Donna will get into that in a little bit. For those who are would like to, we have a website called 1308trees.ca. And if you haven't already, you're welcome to send a letter or a piece of art there. And we've compiled an offering that we'll be sending to the local First Nations and also to the local municipal politicians.
14 minutes.
I'll mute them.
boards, etc. Because it's important to not look away from the destruction, and it's important that we stand together. It's pretty human to feel grief in the moment that we're in when we're facing this climate crisis. And the way to deal with the grief, I think, is to not ignore it or deny it, but to feel it, right? And to feel it together and to keep acting together, or finding ways to share stories, to learn, to organize together. And through building those relationships, we hopefully will and can stop this pipeline, because we need to. The opposition's been going on for many years, and it continues, I think, in all sorts of creative ways. And I think that, when we just pay attention and show up and honor the relations that we have with all of life beyond the non-human, that's part of how we work to become better relatives with the local First Nations. And it's an ongoing journey, and it's a process. I don't know that there's necessarily an endpoint, but it's a really wonderful way to spend our lives, basically. So that's a quick introduction to 1308 trees, and maybe I'll turn it over to Sara and Donna. I think they have some pictures to show us too. Oh, and I just wanted to say one other thing in transition, that there was a really wonderful workshop on how to find birds' nests that was offered recently. And it just taught me so much about staying still and paying attention in a really deep kind of way. And gave me, I guess, a start of a vocabulary for the way the birds relate to each other and the way we could relate to them if we were wise enough to listen. So thank you, Sara and Donna, for sharing what you are learning with us.
Thank you, Rita. Sara, Donna, I'm going to share my screen now, and just let me know when you want me to forward the photos.
Here, Sara and I agreed that I would start us out. Thank you, Nicole and Rita, for starting us out in such a good way. Appreciate it very much. It's an honor to be here today with you all. And Nicole, Rita, Sara, you're all amazing place-based artists and teachers, as well as wearing many other hats and roles. So I'm honored to be here with you. So the Community Nest Finding Network started in order to stop the Trans Mountain Pipeline in Burnaby, in so-called Burnaby. We, the humans, or perhaps I'll speak for myself, as a human in this world, I consider it my obligation or responsibility to look after the lands and waters for future generations, and indeed for all beings in the present as well as the future. And as a settler, the white settler on these unceded, perhaps we could say stolen lands, it's also my responsibility. I understand it also to be my responsibility to look after these lands and waters, as well as my fellow human beings. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Sara. Thank you.
All right. So, yeah, I guess probably many of you have heard that this hummingbird nest has managed to actually stop work on the Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion in about a 1 kilometer section in Burnaby. And like, what a achievement. That, I mean, it's a complicated story, really, because like, nests don't stop extractive projects. Extractive projects just come and destroy all the habitat, all the forests, all the relationships. That's kind of by definition what they are. They just take, extract. And so the story with this hummingbird nest, I'm just going to super briefly just talk around it before sharing more about, you know, our methods and our kind of the more sensory part, the sensory experiential part of what we do. But so there's a law that protects migratory birds. It's an old law. Donna probably knows the actual date of that law, but it's really old. And it's a colonial, you know, Canada law. And it protects migratory birds, and it protects their nests and their eggs. And so it's actually a Canadian law. And so what ended up happening in the Burnett Forest here was the Community Nest Finding Network was able to identify, locate, and then inform the appropriate authorities to the presence of these nests that were in the forest. And I guess it was in February that we first got started with the nest finding. And so it came out of the twin, like it came out of the 1308 Trees Project, which highlighted and spotlighted, you know, the upcoming horrible loss of all these trees, potential loss. And then also, we were also in the area because of the tree sit. And Nicole, you can go to the next picture, I think. The Protect the Planet Stop TMX. Oh yeah. This is part of the art show that was installed as with 1308 Trees that Rita helped put together. And there's a picture of the tree house. It's an occupation that's been there for, I want to say, almost coming up on 150 days now. Maybe it's 140 days. But the trees have been occupied since August of last year. So this is a new tree occupation, and someone is living there. There's a group of people living in the tree, and they're supported by a big ground support community that bring food and, you know, charge batteries and whatnot. And so this is why we were in the forest here, paying attention, was because of these amazing land defenders, water protectors, and you know, the humans in their nest up here. So,
And this tree sit is right in line with the pipeline along the Burnett River corridor in so-called Burnaby, which is really close to three present day names: Burnaby, New Westminster, and Coquitlam. The Cape, Tsleil-Waututh, Squamish, Musqueam, Catsi, Kwantlen, and Coquitlam lands. And the Burnett River flows into the Fraser River and is part of a larger watershed, salmon-bearing watershed.
okay, so the tree sit, partly why we were there. Yeah. Oh, that comes later. No activity permitted on site. Isn't that wonderful? That's a new sign. That's on account of the hummingbird.
Sorry,
But
my
so-
finger slipped there.
Oh, no problem. It's okay. It's nice to, it's okay to bring forward, because in fact it's more, that's what it looks like now. So go ahead actually, and let's pop to the next photo. You can see the sap has risen, a spring has come to the forest, and also a respite from the destruction has also come. And so the Migratory Bird Convention Act protects these nests. It's kind of, you know, we shake our head a little bit at how ridiculous it is that we have these kind of environmentalist laws that would protect a bird and its eggs. And yet when, you know, indigenous nations try to protect their land, you know, they're just, you know, criminalized, and often in a really violent way. It's just, it's a double standard, and it's just, you know, it speaks to some of the undercurrent of the larger story about how we support extraction in the state. Our state supports extraction, and like, you know, bodies like the Canadian Energy Regulator that are supposed to be monitoring these kinds of projects, these oil and gas projects, in fact, are just in service of pushing the projects through. So, but anyway, we took advantage of this law, and we were in there in February realizing, hey, the tree sitters have noticed hummingbirds around here, and Anna's hummingbird's actually the earliest nester in this area. And so, you know, what if we could find a nest? And in fact, that's what happened. Donna, I want to talk about the kind of the way we pay attention, what Rita was mentioning, but I'm wondering if you want to say something before I do.
Well, I'll just say that Anna's hummingbirds are considered migratory birds. As many of you already know, Anna's hummingbirds are here all year round and don't necessarily migrate in this area. But they once did. They once migrated here in the spring and left in late summer. But they're here all year round now. And there are shifts and changes in the migration of birds with the climate crisis, for example, and habitat destruction. So, but yes, they are considered migratory birds.
Yeah, and so their nests are protected under federal law. And so the Community Nest Finding Network, I was realizing it's arisen out of mostly actually the nature school educators, which is, it's not only the nature school educators, but the majority, I would say, of us who are in here doing this work are people that have come out of like Fresh Air Learning and Soaring Eagle Nature School, and which are, you know, two of the several like land-based forest learning programs. And I think it's no accident, actually, because those programs have an emphasis on connection and also have tools and techniques that have been practiced, that, you know, tools for paying attention. And it's mostly just sensory perception, but it's one of the things that in our times, many of us grow up very disconnected to our senses. And so I'll speak just really briefly about the lineage, what I understand my lineage to this work is, and because it is slightly problematic, I'll say, to be honest. I learned about bird language and this kind of deep paying attention from Jenna Rudolph, who's with Soaring Eagle Nature School, but also from John Young, who's one of her teachers. And John Young has popularized a whole school of outdoor education called Coyote Mentoring. He's involved with the Wilderness Awareness School, and his teaching comes from Tom Brown, who is a tracker and teacher on the East Coast, who himself learned from someone called Stalking Wolf, who's an Apache indigenous person. And so there's this kind of circle of, some might, you know, rightly say, appropriation of traditional land-connected indigenous skills. But there's also, I shouldn't even use but, it's a hard thing to talk about because that appropriation is true. And at the same time, the popularization of this way of paying attention in a deep way, I think is a service to us all as we learn it. So I'm really grateful for that messy lineage that is now with us, that we are now sharing. So the nest finders, that's our method. So I'll backtrack a tiny bit to say, you know, to be honest and fair about this, Trans Mountain is not supposed to be cutting any trees during the active nesting season. And they admit that in their work plans. And one of the ways they get around that is by sending in their own biologists to do nesting surveys. And so they go in, they look, they listen, they walk through, they say, oh yeah, there's a nest. And they actually do, it's called a buffer. They actually do put in like a 20-meter buffer around the nest. And then they're not supposed to cut until the birds have fledged the nest. And so the idea being, yes, we're following the law, we're protecting the eggs in the nest. Next year, well, sorry, but your habitat's gone because we're going to cut it all anyway. So it's
There
this weird,
maybe-
weird thing. Yeah, Donna, go.
So according to the best practices of this Migratory Bird Convention Act, birds who are nesting have up to a 30-meter buffer of protection until they fledge. Now, the truth is that the biologists are allowed to use their own professional judgment. And so what we were noticing at the Burnett site was they were sometimes giving up to 20-meter buffer. But the federal biologists that are brought in to do the nest sweeps, as they're sort of colloquially called, and it's interesting that they're called sweeps, because to me, a sweep is something that's done kind of quickly. And I think the biologists are in some ways set up to fail, because to find nests is a longish and patient process. And it's not necessarily an economically efficient process in the colonial sense. So, Sara, hopefully I've set you up a little bit to talk about the process of noticing and finding these nests.
Yeah, that's great. That's totally it. So what we quickly learned, well, we started going in February, and we would set out before dawn, so that we would be on site while the dawn was just rising. And that was partly because that's when the birds are active, but that's also partly because of actually security present on the site at the time. And so we would be in place, we would go in, we would sit down. So a group of us, maybe, 3 to 6 of us, would sit down in a kind of a wide area and just listen, just watch, just listen. We wouldn't move. Sometimes we would be texting back and forth. Oh, I see something. But that's a bit of a distraction. Just to say that we were connected a little bit, but we were each in our own listening and looking. And the first time we went in, it was just getting to understand the lay of the land. And I think we honed in on 2 individual birds who were in the area. And then the second time we went in, the same approach. We went in very early and just sat down, this time oriented more towards where one of the birds had been seen several times. And that's when we were able to, just by watching and sitting in the same place, notice, oh, look, there she is. And oh, look how high she's going. And in fact, the first nest we found was, most Anna's hummingbirds we think they nest, up to about 10 meters high. This one was like 20 meters up at least. And the nests are 4 centimeters in diameter. They're tiny. And so it was, it felt like a celebration day, where oh, look, a nest. I mean, we didn't know what was going to happen or what it would mean. And we got on the phone immediately and we called a provincial wildlife officer who we'd already been in dialogue with. Turns out it's not even the province's jurisdiction because of what Donna was saying, it being migratory. But so the provincial wildlife officer actually came in and documented the nest, and we had to use a spotting scope to get it close enough so we could really determine that's what it was. But after a while, when you're sitting quietly, I think what happens is the birds are not threatened by you. They realize that you're not there to harm them. You're not stalking them. You're not hunting. You're not making a lot of noise or crashing around. You don't have a chainsaw, that's for sure. And I felt that the birds were, they sort of start to reveal themselves to us, just their lives in the forest. We start seeing what they're doing. We're noticing, all very curious. Oh, why is the female hummingbird coming down to the trunk and she goes along the trunk like this. What is she doing? Is she getting water? Is she getting lichen? Is she getting insects? You know, just all these questions about her life and her space and her home. Beautiful. We did notice as we kept paying attention that, you know, there were so many hummingbirds in this particular piece of forest. It's the habitat is incredibly rich for them. Generally speaking, this little piece there's not a lot of humans go in there because it's between Highway 1 and the railroad. It's a long 1 kilometer stretch of land. It's just this beautiful, dense forest with an understory of healthy osoberry and salmonberry flowers that were, you know, would all come into bloom. And there were so many hummingbirds, like, I don't even know, maybe there's like more than a dozen nests in there, probably 2 male hummingbirds and like a dozen females spread out over the area. So rich. And, you know, the females also, she does a thing where she's kind of loud about her nest because she makes while there's the sound of, oh, see, that's the size of the nest. Look at that, 4 centimeters.
Was a nest.
That's the Anna's hummingbird nest.
Yeah.
I just
And
want to say the one, Donna, before you go, I just want to say the one thing that the mama does when she's approaching her nest, she'll fly to a branch that's close by and she just makes that little noise and then she flies to another branch. And then she goes right to her nest. So if you're listening, you can hear them. She tells you right where her nest is every time. Okay, go, Donna. It's so beautiful. These beautiful birds. They're so amazing.
Description, Sarah. Thank you. One thing that made obvious to the birders in the audience is that the nests aren't really found by, I think, I used to assume, and many folks assume, that you find nests by, you know, quietly and carefully observing as you walk through the forest. And the truth is that first hummingbird nest, as Sara was trying to say, 20 feet up in a tree, and is only 4 centimeters in diameter, is really not something you see with your human eyes walking through the forest. You would never see it. It was even hard to see once we knew it was there. So the point being that we have to listen and watch the birds. They tell us where the nest is by watching and listening to their activity. It's not so much by looking for nests. Just to be clear about that process, because we have many people who are really excited now about nest finding and have thought that simply by walking through the forest and looking for nests, they will find them. But yeah, just to underline what Sara said, the point is listening quietly, patiently in one spot and observing the bird activity. This photo is a photo of the second hummingbird's nest that was found, and you can see it's on the ground. So when we first found it, it had a hummingbird in it, but it had like a 2-meter buffer around it. And then all around it were clear-cut trees. So it wasn't protected in time, either unintentionally or intentionally. It wasn't found. And when we did find it, though, it did have the hummingbird in it, and we did let the wildlife officer know that it was there. And subsequently, some tape was put around it so that the workers on the site would not disturb it. But nevertheless, and no one can know for sure, but this hummingbird left her nest, and the nest ended up on the ground. Now, did somebody intentionally try and destroy the nest, knowing it was there? Well, we had no proof of that. And certainly it didn't look like there were any marks going up the tree where somebody tried to scale the tree or anything like that. But she only had a 2-meter buffer around her nest. And the Migratory Bird Convention Act suggests up to a 30-meter buffer. So if for no other reason, this nest may simply have been abandoned and or destroyed because it only had a 2-meter buffer around it.
Donna?
Yeah.
Just a question, and I'll save my questions for the end, but in terms of whether it's intentional or not, the destruction has happened. Yeah. And so what is the punishment under the Bird Act, or is there any sort of repercussion for Trans Mountain doing this? Basically, I don't care if it was intentional or not, it was done, right?
Yeah, well, I guess it leaves up in the air. I mean, people are saying, oh, well, maybe she left her nest because it was, it had been recently rainy and windy. Well, that's what it's like to live on Coast Salish land. It's rainy and windy sometimes. So there's no, under colonial law, there's no proof. There was no proof. But it was really apparent to me that we had left her, she had been left vulnerable and unprotected because of human activity and Trans Mountain activity specifically. Thanks for asking that question, Rita. So yeah, that's my sad story. And this is a picture of a friend's hand. We found the nest on the ground together when we went to look at her for her. Yeah. It was part of the story. At least Sara, Rita became part of the story that was built and that federal wildlife officers knew of, even though the federal wildlife officer said to us, you have no proof, but at least they knew that this was, again, part of the story. Yeah.
Thanks, Tom.
Yeah, the wildlife officers the federal wildlife officers were really clear with us that that they needed proof. I mean, they needed proof of destruction, and finding a nest on the ground is not proof. It could have been, some people said this one was predated by crows. And I totally agree with what Donna said, that it was because the nest had been left vulnerable. But nest predation is a common occurrence. So we all know, like, that's part of the reason why birds have so many eggs in their nests. And also they customarily will build another nest, especially if it's early in the season. They'll build another nest and have another go at it. If their nest. So that was our hope for her. Our hope for her was that she at least was somewhere else building another nest somewhere. And then Donna, remember that other nest that we saw that was being built right beside? I'm sure I bet you that was her. We saw. Did you know, people, that that hummingbirds, and I'm not sure what other birds do this, but hummingbirds, they go to the place where they're considering putting their nests, and they go right. I saw this happen, and it was just, my heart soared, to use that beautiful expression. But the hummingbird comes right on. What's that? A quote? Yeah. A quote from Chief Dan George's poem, "My Heart Soars." Beautiful poem. Heart soars. Absolutely a must read. If you haven't already read that poem, it's available online. It's also a published book from the 1970s. Tsleil-Waututh poet and actor Chief Leonard George. My Heart Soars. Yes. Sorry, Sara. No, it's good. That's why I said that. That's why I said that. But this is what happened. So the hummingbird, she flies on top of her branch that she's thinking about. She's got her wings going and she does a 360 all the way around on that very spot like this. I saw her do it, flies. And then the next time I was there, 6 days later, there was a nest right there, little tiny nest. So what a beautiful thing to get to observe. And we did see a hummingbird building a nest very close by here, to where this nest was destroyed. So hopefully it was her and she was just giving it another go. I think one of the things that's come out of this is that, you know, we go in, we sit, we pay attention, we document nest locations. So we find the GPS coordinates, we describe all the conditions where she is, what the tree is like, and then we submit those reports to, well, we've been submitting them to Trans Mountain directly, actually, and then they pass the information on to their biologists who then buffer the nest. Although I'm not actually sure that ever happened, but it's based on the idea that they will protect the birds if they know they're there. And we also submit to the Canadian Energy Regulator that's been monitoring compliance, and we've been submitting to the wildlife officers as well at their request. So
one of the things early on that we didn't realize was that we could document nest building as well. So we were photographically documenting with GPS coordinates the bird nests. But I happened to take this picture of this robin with nesting materials in its mouth because I was like, oh, isn't that amazing? Here's a nest with nesting materials and we're looking for her nest or their nest. Not sure if this is male or female, it doesn't matter. And then we found out subsequently that we could also be documenting nesting activity. In other words, birds collecting materials for nest building was considered proof and good documentation by the regulator.
Yeah, and on that thread, you know, like as we sat in this forest, primarily paying attention to the hummingbirds, we like, just because if you just spend time there, you hear the vocalizations of the other birds. So it's very easy to hear, okay, there's a song sparrow pair just over there that are singing. And then maybe, you know, then over here, there's a towhees over there. And oh, look, there's another song sparrow pair. Actually, there's 4 song sparrow pairs. If you just walk alongside the tracks, you hear 4 different song sparrow pairs. They're not there by accident. Most of them, if they're there at this point, they're nesting there. And so, you know, even though we don't have necessarily documentation of every nest, it's really easy when you stop and sink into a place to witness the creatures that are living there, that are making their homes there. So it's a tricky piece about trying to document. You know, with song sparrows and towhees, their nests are often on the ground. They're hidden really well. They're often in blackberries. You know, you can't be like, wow, what's in here? You can't be looking for the nests. So because it's not best practices to go, you know, moving around, looking, you disturb the birds and then maybe they leave their nests because they think it's not safe. And likewise, we're not supposed to do any nest finding when it's raining, because when it's raining, if your presence means the mama or the nest, the incubator is off the nest for any period of time, the cold rain can harm their eggs. So you're not even supposed to do nest finding in the rain. But yeah, it's so obvious when you're in a place like this rich forest alongside the brunette that, you know, there's so many birds that call it home. And if you destroy it, you're going to be destroying their homes. It's a very obvious fact, but hard to document.
As Sara mentioned, listening to the birds is also an indication that they are either nest building or soon to be nest building, because birds will often have their vocalizations, have their sounds, their songs in relation to one another. And you can start to hear the pairing of birds in preparation for or during mating. So that can be a sign, that sound, just listening for those pairings is also an indicator. Wow, there's probably a nest in here, just to underline what Sara was saying, but in a different way. Perhaps I could just mention in here, maybe Nicole, going back to the slide that says persistence on it, from the beautiful part of the beautiful ongoing, one of the beautiful ongoing exhibitions that Rita helped to set up at the base of the tree set. People have been bringing creative offerings to this tree set from the beginning. And as Rita and Sara both already mentioned, but there was a specific call to the wider community to bring creative offerings to this site. You can see a red dress in the background, making the connection between the pipelines and murdered missing Indigenous women and girls, Two-Spirit, and the sign there of persistence. When we found that, when the hummingbirds were found, there was quite quickly a connection made with many of the Indigenous on my social media platforms to the story of the hummingbird that comes from Quechua-speaking Indigenous in present day so-called Ecuador and Peru, this Quechua story of the hummingbird. And it's become pan-Indigenous. A Haida artist, Nicole Yagulanis, illustrated a book about this story. And indeed, it's become pan-cultural, and it's this beautiful parable for the environment, as it says at the top of the book. And so I just want to let the audience know. And besides My Heart Soars as a beautiful, I consider must-have book for living on these lands, Flight of the Hummingbird is also a beautiful book, and it tells this Quechua parable of the hummingbird as representing persistence. And this little hummingbird in this little parable is in the midst of a forest fire. And what she does is she goes to a creek and she takes up the water into her bill, and then she flies quickly to the forest fire and she drops the water she carries in her beak onto the fire. And her brothers and sisters, her relatives, the other animals in the forest watch her do this, and they say, "What are you doing? You're not going to put the fire out with the water that's in your bill. You're not going to do that." And she answers, "But I'm doing what I can." And it's just a beautiful, inspiring parable for me, and I guess for many. This story of this hummingbird who she does what she can to protect the environment, and she's persistent about it. She doesn't give up. So beautiful, beautiful story, and inspiring. And indeed, it's kind of magical, seems kind of magical and amazing that, again, this mama hummingbird is the one that's not unlike this Quechua indigenous parable, is frontline in terms of protecting the forest. Yes, thank you. Flight of the Hummingbird is the name of the book, by the way. Yeah, you could get it at Massey Books or order it through Massey Books, which is a local indigenous bookstore in Vancouver, so-called Vancouver.
Nice. I
Thanks,
just
Donna.
wanted to say that we have about 15, 20 minutes left. So if we want to open up for questions soon, I know Rita might have some, and we can do that discussion, or we can keep going, whatever you all feel is best. So
I just got a tiny bit more that I want
Yeah,
to share
100%.
because the nest finding, it's really exciting, you know, like people are really excited by this, and a lot of, you know, birders and other people that are connected in this way, you know, want to help with this work. And our network, the community nest finding network, has really been expanding. It's a bit of a slow expansion as we, you know, build relationships with the humans that want to work with us. And we welcome help. But I will say that the truth is that 95% of this work is actually not nest finding. So 95% of it is monitoring what's happening in the area. So maybe, yeah, stay here, stay on this picture for a second, because this is what's happening in the area. This is what's happening. And so if we get there and this has already happened, we can't do our work. So we have to know where Trans Mountain is working and where they're about to work. So that's the key thing. Right now, we're not doing a lot of nest finding locally. There is still some happening, but mostly what we're doing is monitoring the work that's happening. We have a bunch of different sections that people are monitoring, where we'll walk the section once a week, or once every 2 weeks, or twice a week, whatever it is for everyone. And we have networks that we can communicate within about, you know, what we're noticing. We have identified the patterns of surveying that precede active cutting, and so we're closely watching. And we've also recently done a little trip up to the Bridal Falls area, where near between Chilliwack and Hope, which is where there's a lot of active work going on right now. And so we have a monitoring network that is just in formation in that area, with, you know, half a dozen people already kind of monitoring and reporting back. So just so that we can position ourselves, if we need to do any nest finding work, we know where to go. So I'm not kidding when I say it's 95% of the work is not actually nest finding. So that's the phase we're in now. Also, just to support our expansion, we have had requests actually province-wide. And so we have just launched a GoFundMe campaign. And Donna, do you want to speak to that?
Sure. There's
Yeah.
a GoFundMe campaign that we just put up yesterday to support the expansion of the community nest finding network at the local level. It's just for materials. It's for to be able to get around and to properly have the tools to properly monitor along the pipeline route at the local level. And yeah, because we've heard and we've already had requests for materials, like Sara has said. So that GoFundMe is going to be a link for you guys. I passed it on to Nicole already. Thank you in advance for your consideration and donating to our work, to all our work in protecting the lands and waters. And yeah.
And great, that's true. And we're a volunteer network. So this is not about supporting human individuals. It's about, like Donna said, it's about material support. Nicole, can you go back one picture to the hummingbird nest on the, yeah, that one, this one. This is the actual bird whose nest was destroyed that we witnessed with the wildlife officers present. So this is her. This is the actual one. I'm sure that she's made another nest by now, but look at her. she wants our attention. She's there. She's like, oh, help. By this point, her branch had already been partly knocked down by the heavy equipment, and the heavy equipment was off the site. But anyway, there she is. That's her. That's actually her. So with that, let's close and welcome questions with just a acknowledgement and gratitude for our interconnection with all beings, and with, you know, the tremendous richness of life that surrounds us, even when it's sometimes hard to see because of our human domination of the landscape. So thank you to the hummingbird warriors and the land defenders, the hummingbirds.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you all so much. I'll let you, Rita, and everyone else kind of take over, but I'm just going to say that I will drop that link to the GoFundMe in the chat. I just got to go copy and paste it. So, and if you have any questions yourself, definitely write in the chat as well.
Okay, thank you so much, Sara and Donna, for sharing that. I had a question about jurisdiction, because that area that we're talking about around the Brunette River is also where the Nooksack dace require water, right, habitat basically, and it should be protected under the Species at Risk Act. And recently I noticed on Twitter that Coast Protectors had tweeted that the Department of Fisheries and Oceans has a memorandum of understanding with the CER. So when issues get raised, they go straight to TMX, and maybe or maybe not, they go to CER. But the environmental climate change ministry, I think that you were talking to, if I'm not mistaken, they don't have an MOU with the CER. So that kind of helped, I think, in this situation, maybe to hold them accountable. But like, because there's lots of different forms of legislation, and some of them are, you know, we work, or citizens work very hard to try to make them meaningful, but there are other pieces of legislation that just seem to be bypassed, like the Sara Species at Risk Act. Just to maybe think about commenting on that, and also in terms of, you know, this is a larger question that I don't think any of us can answer immediately, but the question of how to uphold Indigenous law and make it visible to these folks that are basically violating it all the time. So it's always an ongoing kind of question in my mind, in the back of how to organize it. Yeah, so like, I'm excited for the birds, obviously, but I'm also worried about the Nooksack dace and all the other creatures that rely on the water as well as the trees. So maybe just a question about kind of thinking about jurisdiction and how to make different forms of jurisdiction more visible.
Oh, I love it. I love it. I love your question, and your questions, really. Yeah, you're right about the Species at Risk Act. It does not have any teeth for several reasons. One of them is because it only, my belief is that it only, my understanding is that it only governs like public, so-called public lands. So it has to be federal lands. And and also you have to, for each species, you have to have a team of biologists have to develop like a plan for bringing the species back to vitality. I don't know the actual language that they use, but so they have to have a plan. And if there's no plan, like there's no plan for the Nooksack dace, which is there's only, I think, between 4 and 6 small subpopulations of this small fish, and they're all in this region. And so there's a sensitive protected habitat with, it's signed and marked. It says, you know, species at risk habitat, do not mow or cut. And yes, because of a memorandum of understanding, so-called, they're able to just destroy that riparian habitat and make new habitat somewhere else that they think will be good for this endangered fish. So yeah, it's a very problematic truth. And in fact, some of the Protect the Planet, Stop TMX people who are biologists are, you know, incredibly frustrated by the layers of bureaucracy and ineffectiveness of the regulations. And, you know, it's true that I think also that there is you know, with Trans Mountain in particular, like just this like ongoing reckless disregard for the environmental regulations.
Mm.
And so there's, you know, we've been reporting stream violations and air quality violations, noise violations, it just goes on, mask violations, it just goes on and on. Sediment control violations, it's just like a violation after violation, which is kind of the nature of the project. But your question about how to uphold and make visible the Indigenous laws, I feel this sense of bubbling excitement right now around how about some of the opportunities that are coming out of this work, where we acknowledge, you know, this colonial law that protects birds' nests and eggs. But what happens if we take our observation methods further and say, even before there's if just say they're not about to cut an area, why don't we go in and identify these are the nest locations for these different birds? And then under Indigenous law, let's protect those habitats and say, you know, whether they're nesting actively now or not, this is where they're nesting and it will be where they nest again. Birds have relationships with particular trees. They come back to the same place every year. Not all birds do that, but many do. The Anna's hummingbird does. She returns to the same tree. So, you know, as a salmon returns to its stream of origin, so birds also return to the place where they live. And I feel like there's a natural extension of this work that let's so we have some folks that we're talking to already about expanding the methodology and translating it into actual laws that could be understood in a colonial context.
Thanks, Sara.
Whether they're colonial laws, or I think they'd be better if they were Indigenous laws, if it was an articulation of the Indigenous law that was sort of in relation to the colonial version of it. So it's happening.
Yeah.
And this isn't just about, as you know, Rita, this isn't just about stopping the pipeline. This is about giving the land back as settlers, working to recognize that these lands and waters we are on are not ours and never were, and that the Indigenous of these lands and waters have caretaken this land well since time out of mind. And it's only been in colonial times that all this destruction has gone on, and that those Indigenous laws respect the laws of nature and the well-being for all, including, and respect for all humans, respect for all beings, including between humans, relationships between humans, the well-being.
Yeah.
All of
yeah, I think when I was asking the question, I was remembering like the press conference out in front of the tank farm with Chief Judy Wilson and with Kaya George, and just like, you know, building the relationships and the conversations around it. And, you know, Kaya George from Tsleil-Waututh said something that really stuck with me about how the hummingbird is a messenger of what's to come. And, you know, I just want to, you know, maybe honor that, and also mention the importance of ceremony and of kind of caring for not just heart and body and mind, but also spirit. And I was asked to invite folks if they would like, there's a sacred fire that happens on Saturdays at Crab Park, and it's happening today from 2 to 8 for anybody who happens to be free or around. So I just wanted to open up that invitation as well. And that kind of ceremony is ongoing, I guess, in terms of how we connect and relate with each other. Okay.
I just had one thing to add, if that's okay. So I'm actually located, and I think Rita knows this, but I live about, I guess, 200 meters from the tank farm on Burnaby Mountain. And I grew up here. I was raised and still live here and call this place home. And while it's not my own traditional territory, you know, I do feel very connected to the land. And I have to say that, you know, it is really shocking and saddening. I mean, I can't even find the words to really describe it when you look at all of the destruction just the tank farm has done. And just that space has already destroyed so many habitats. And then seeing then that we know that that tank farm's not just it. As you were saying, there's that area down by the Brunette River. It goes all the way out, right? And it's not just one animal's habitat. It is just thousands and thousands of animals that have been affected by this. And I wrote notes, sorry, hold on. And when I was, seeing that nest that, fell down, yeah, we could sit here and think of 1,000 ways that that nest might have fallen. And I really love what you said, Rita, which is, it doesn't matter. It already happened, it fell. And whether that was from natural causes or human causes, we all have a right, or we all have, a job to help defend these animals and to make sure that they are protected, because again, that's one nest that we saw. We can imagine that this work has been ongoing for years at this point, decades, whatever you want, right? And how many nests have been destroyed up until this point, how many dens and all of that kind of things, how many eggs or babies or whatever you want to call it, right, have been affected, destroyed, hurt, harmed up until this point. So yeah, I just absolutely loving everything that all of you are sharing, and I really appreciate it from the bottom of my heart. This is a place I call home. I think many of you might know my Uncle John. Like, he was my neighbor, and his daughters and I, we grew up in the forest here. That's the way we spent our whole childhood, and to see that it's slowly being taken away, it's just heartbreaking. So yeah, I don't know if that was a question or a comment, but I just want to say thank you to all of you.
Thank you for saying that, Nicole, because I keep thinking when I look at the devastation in the tank farm, like, what does it need to become? Like, it needs to become a land school, or it needs to become, I don't know, a mushroom farm. It needs something to heal it, obviously, to take it back to what it was before, or even better, that's what we need. And to maybe have a vision of what's needed there in the face of all this destruction. Yeah, it has been heartbreaking. And thank you for sharing those heartfelt words.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's definitely something that we've been, experiencing, is the challenge of, it's not even a challenge. It's when you get to know a place intimately, as we do, with sitting and watching and paying attention to the creatures that are there, the beautiful, beautiful trilliums, the Pacific wren, all of the life, and then to return and it's gone. And that's what we've been seeing down at the Burnett until we were able to, or until the stop work order was issued. There were many nests that we had not yet documented, and several that we had that became a clear cut. So it's very, we do make space for the grieving, and we have to, because otherwise we just, you can't keep it quiet. And I will say also, I think, Rita, you were the one that said this, it's like a way of life. And I think that the piece that heals the grief is the action. And I just found, as I have stepped more and more into alignment with my personal desire to protect all life and defend all life, I feel this, I've become a part of a community of like-hearted, like-spirited, not entirely all the same, but, coming from different places, but we have this common ground of action. Actually, like, waking up in the morning and saying, what kind of direct action can I take today to protect the lands and waters and beings of this place? And it's like, finally, I feel like my spirit is in alignment now that I'm doing this work wholeheartedly. There's no split anymore. So there's the grief and there's the action, and they exist together.
And many forms of action, like, I just want to acknowledge the people who've been working on the financial piece of it to try to stop the insuring of this, for instance. And there's many strategies and many tactics, and I think it's really important to pay attention to them and coordinate them. So just to acknowledge that too.
Yeah, just like
Andrew,
oh, sorry. I was going to say, just like the hummingbird story that Donna was sharing, it's doing your part, right? There's no small part. Even if it is a small part, it is a big action, right? So yeah, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you, Sara.
no, you said the thing. That's exactly it. It's each of us has our own offerings, and it's not it's not one better than the other. They're different. Yeah. And it just, I think for me anyway, with the nest finding, it emerged out of me taking small steps into connection with the issue. So, at first I started emailing people, and then I was talking to your Uncle John, and he was saying, oh yeah, you can report that. And he mentored me a little bit in how to report a violation that I'd seen. And it was just these little steps that I took. And then all of a sudden, we're in the forest, there's a nest, we've stopped the project. It's emerged out of the commitment that each of us has made to doing our part as individuals with our own abilities. So, and there's so many parts of it.
And like Sara said, more recently with the work of John Preisel and Jim Layden on so-called Burnaby Mountain, for example, they both put in years of work monitoring that section of the pipeline in so-called Burnaby.
Yeah, I grew up walking many streams with my Uncle John, looking at, all of it, looking at how it affected it. Before we even had digital cameras, like making sure that we were properly caring for the waterways of this mountain and surrounding areas. So yeah, I really appreciate all of you and everything that everyone does. But yeah, this has just been so beautiful. I mean, if you want to keep going, for sure, definitely. I guess I had one last question. What do you kind of see for yourselves as the next step? What is it going forward? I know you said kind of like collecting materials and having that, but is there, a step that you see in the near future?
Yeah, I think so. I think the developing the monitoring network is really important. And I think that, the lower mainland is where there's resistance all along the whole project route, but I think the lower mainland is where there's really a very active, huge resistance. There are still myriad landowners that are not consenting to the work happening on their land throughout the Fraser Valley. And as there are along the route as well, but in the Fraser Valley, they're really far behind. And so developing that monitoring network and having, inviting people to come into connection with a particular piece of land and open your hearts to it and work in service of the land, I think is that's the next step for me. So yeah, our network development and monitoring. And if people want to contact us, actually, we do have an email. It's as it is our name, Community Nest Finding Network @gmail.com. People are welcome to get a hold of us. And Rita, you mentioned we do have that training video that we did about nest finding. So we'd be happy to share that. Or also, I think we'll probably make another one soon.
I'm going to encourage Rita to say a few words.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think, on this micro scale, we've collected all this art and writing that will get messaged and sent over to local leaders to, I think, support them and encourage them and maybe, help them to find ways to step up. And I think on the larger level, though, like the question of climate change, I think people need to understand that we cannot afford this pipeline expansion. And so I think there's just ongoing work about that, like messaging until it, it's, as Sara said, like quite strong here in the lower mainland, but it needs to keep growing. And so to keep speaking about it, and also I think to have alternatives to it. Like we understand that alternative energies like solar, wind, etc., geothermal, are more affordable than ever, and the pipeline needs to stop. So I would invite creative ideas about what to turn the pipeline into, but that is sort of, I think, an ongoing, that's the ongoing work as far as I see it. And I did also want to acknowledge that there remain a number of people who are going through the court system for their opposition to the pipeline. And, I don't think everybody has to get arrested, and it's a huge suck on one's time and energy if or when one does. So I encourage people to think about creative ways to do the work, and, become something that isn't just sort of land defenders or so-called activists, but like, girl guide groups, or nurses, or, like both the usual and the unusual suspects, I think, need to find ways to make it clear that there's no social license for this pipeline expansion. There never has been, and there still isn't.
Very nice.
Yes.
So much, Rita. And so true. Yeah, so if there isn't any more questions, I'll end it here. But I just wanted to say a huge thank you from the bottom of my heart to all of your work and the work of many others. And just saying how meaningful these conversations are and how meaningful these kind of events are to spread awareness, because I think it's one thing to see, I follow many of you on Facebook and my uncle and all of that. So I was seeing a lot of articles, but I think it's such a different thing to gather in community, whether it's online or in person, right? And now it kind of has to be online, but to gather in community, to have conversations and to hear really from, the people on the front line, what is going on, what's happening, what's important, all of that. So yeah, just from the bottom of my heart to all of you, I just raised my hands to you, and just, Hojka, thank you so much for your work. So yeah, and I do have a small little gift for all three of you, but just to make it COVID safe, I'm gonna drop it in a little plastic bag by the watch house, and whenever any of you go up there, you can gather. They'll be labeled, so you can know who's who. But I just wanted to say thank you so much. So
Thank you.
yeah.
Thank you.
Aw, thanks,
so
Nicole.
much.
That's so sweet.
Yeah.
Let's
Thank
just,
you. I know.
Sweet.
Bye,
Have an
thank you,
amazing
everyone.
day. Thank you, everyone.
Same.
Thanks, everyone, for tuning in. And
Bye-bye.
I'll send the GoFundMe link as well. It is in the chat, but I'll send that in the follow-up email. So just so everyone has that.
Thank you, everybody in the audience, too.
Thanks.
Bye.
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 get the sacred fire, you rascals.
Takes one to know one.
Yes.
You guys are so funny. Bye. Thank
Bye.
you.